Hello and welcome back. I want to introduce the next module in our sequence, which is the introduction of ethnography. By now in the class, what I'm hoping is that you've had a moment to look through all of the introductory material, and you've also had an opportunity to take a look at the um, history of anthropology, what is anthropology, the history of science, and sort of where anthropology fits. In this particular module, you're going to find a list of different reading materials, which I'd like to cover two of them here, and also a slide presentation that I'm going to very briefly go over as well. So the first article I want to talk about is Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. And this is it's a wonderful article about a researcher that goes into the field and gets a lot of information by sort of participating in the culture, but particularly living with people who are hunting large ox. And what he wants to do is he wants to provide this group with sort of a goodbye holiday gift before he leaves. It's sort of a thank you. It's a gesture of goodwill before he leaves. And what he details is a moment where he produces this ox. He buys this ox and gives it to the group of people he's doing ethnography with, and finds that all of them are insulting the ox. That essentially he was ripped off, and he bought a sickly looking animal, and that they were all going to become sick themselves as a result of eating this animal. And it was personally very difficult for him to take that kind of banter. And I mean, after all, he had spent all his time trying to get to know people and observing their life way and sort of documenting this. And at the end, by giving this gesture, a gift that most of us, I think, would be a friendly gesture, he found himself being sort of teased about it. And one of the things that he learned as a lesson in the field was this is nothing short of a social leveling mechanism, which is very common for people, where we tend to kind of banter people or insult people that might be hierarchical or hierarchically just above us a little bit, maybe like our older siblings, or maybe we might talk trash to people, like when we're on the basketball court and we're trying to compete with someone, and they may have this meteoric rise in terms of ability and skill, and we might just wind up talking negatively about them because we want to kind of bring them down to a level that is equivalent to us, right? And I won't go too far into that, except, in terms of what we have with the Kalahari, the Bushmen, and our author, Richard Borshay Lee, he provides this. They're insulting him back, and he takes it personally. And rather than recognizing that the social mechanization here is to bring him down to the level that is equivalent to all of them, which is the gesture of warming his heart, because they're trying to get him to kind of leave the space of his head. They don't want him to develop a big ego about giving a gift and being the big gift giver. They want to move his attention from ego into the warmth of his heart. So itself, the article is a really heartwarming piece of ethnographic evidence. It tells us a little bit about hunting. It tells us a little bit about competition among Kalahari hunters. What I find particularly charming about this is that it also teaches us that the author is personally moved by the subject in a way that, let's say, a biologist would not be moved by jellyfish, right? Or a chemist might not be moved by chemicals. But a person studying culture and people might be personally affected by their subject, which does take us to the second article, which is Tricking and Tripping, Fieldwork on Prostitution during the era of AIDS, HIV, right? And what you're going to find is a very short and brief vignette here where the author, Claire Stirk, also has a very similar thing occur, where she begins to internalize some of the work that she's doing and is personally moved by the material, witnessing culture, right? And so this is something that we want to learn, something that we want to kind of put in our pocket here, right? What we were looking at in the last module was this idea that authors intellects, scholars, PhDs, right, have an incredible amount of authority in terms of what they're dispelling in terms of information and what their credentials provide them with in terms of access and the microphone that it gives them, right? And how much we trust people that are experts in their field. And I'm certainly not trying to encourage you to push against experts, right? But in that last segment, we look at experts and how biased experts can be. And in this module, what we're looking at is that kind of personal interaction that we have as anthropological researchers, right? Which then takes us to the slide presentation. So again, I want to encourage you to look at the slides along with what we're doing here with our videos, because there are basically 4 things I want to cover. One of them is the work of Franz Boas. Boas is recognizably the founding principal figure for American anthropology. Boas established the first kind of school of anthropology at Columbia University in the early 20th century, excuse me. And the premise of doing anthropology from the Boasian perspective is to not do anthropology from an armchair, right? Not to do it from the perspective of just reading about a culture and postulating huge things about culture, more than essentially saying that cultures themselves need to be viewed, observed, and studied at first hand, right? Researchers need to live with their subject, experience life with their subject, and essentially explain life from a first-hand account. Boas was incredibly antagonistic towards any type of scientific explanation for race. He was also really antagonistic towards the school of psychology. And what we're going to find is Boas himself pushed against psychology, and so did all of the sort of academic disciples, right? People that studied under Boas did the same thing as well. So Boas shows up, and the first thing that he's pushing against is Freud's concept around the Oedipus complex. And if you're familiar with the Oedipus complex, or if not, I do suggest you looking it up, right? Maybe do a very brief Google search on that. The idea is that for young boys, it was thought among the psychoanalysis community that all young boys at some point in their lives were going to feel some level of competition with their biological father and some sort of physical attraction towards their mother. And this was something that was introduced during the early 20th century, and I mean, captivated people's attention, but also really frightened people at the same time, right? And Boas argues with his earliest field work that part of the reason why young boys might actually experience this from the perspective of a child is that a child lives, again, early 1900s, right? A child might spend the entire day with his mother, and 100% is getting attention from his mother. And then suddenly at the end of the workday, the father comes home. And suddenly mom's attention shifts from child right to father. And what that does for the child is it makes for a very confusing social environment and could create jealousy and animosity over this new figure that comes in for a couple hours a night that seems to vanish every morning and then reassert themselves at the end of every day. Above that, the idea that most people in the West did not practice or don't practice co-sleeping with their children puts young children in separate rooms. And so that at the end of every night, mother and father go into their own chamber, sort of close the door and leave children to do their own thing, like maybe even cry it out in their cribs, right? So as far as Freud is concerned, right? Freud is saying that this is a universal, sequential, developmental kind of stage for young boys. And Boas is arguing that this is only the result, not of a natural sequence of development, but only the result of a patriarchal system, right? And argues that when we encourage a patriarchy and males are dominating a household and are the social figure that goes out every day and then comes home, and women are largely domestic, it creates that tension between young boys and their fathers, and essentially looks at mom as an object, right, in between the struggles between a young boy and the father. And I think you could see that this gets replicated every generation, right? Young boys learn to be competitive, they compete with other males, and then you get this incredibly sort of toxic environment where males are constantly competing for success, and maybe even dangerously, the attention of females, right? So Boaz shows up, has this like unprecedented argument for, or maybe against psychology. Now that is coupled with the work of Bronislaw Malinowski. Malinowski here on slide number 11 is a researcher that essentially wanted to also do the same type of work that Boaz did, except what Malinowski's doing is he's going into the field and just observing culture, like, behavior by behavior, documenting how people are behaving. And instead of coming up with really grand assessments for why he thinks people are doing things culturally, he begins essentially creating the paradigm for what field work looks like today, which is just social documentation, right? So in a very classic text now, titled Sailors of the Western Pacific, right? It's about a 500-page text. It's a lot to get through, but about 490 pages of that is also social documentation, right? It has almost like a biblical stature in terms of what we do with social documentation. But maybe like the last 10 or 15 pages is his assessment of why people are doing what they're doing. And that really sets the stage for how we see contemporary ethnography sort of unfolding, right? So it was Boaz and Malinowski that are both doing this. And Malinowski as well was antagonistic towards psychology. And he argued just the same that the developmental stages that occur and the Oedipus complex need to be pushed against. And more importantly, going back to Boaz, there was this argument that if all cultures were moving through a series of developmental stages, as we saw with Tyler and Morgan in the previous video, then the assumption was that all cultures probably went from matriarchies to patriarchies. And what Boaz and Malinowski both argued in their writings, more Boaz than Malinowski, is that there are some cultures that went from patriarchy to matriarchy. So either we referred those groups as culturally devolving, right? Or maybe culturally evolving into a new level of adaptation. And so it takes the monolith, which is patriarchy being essentially the epitome of life, and kind of derails or de-emphasizes that as a value for human beings. So we're thinking about psychology over here. Of course, from the last bit of information, we were looking at science as well. And then you have two really refreshing characters, Boaz and Malinowski, that are saying, when it comes to science, there is no scientific way of really measuring race. Also, when it comes to psychology, culture is learned, and it is learned largely from the structures that we have around us, and namely the assault on patriarchy. I think is a refreshing thing, perhaps even maybe most of us today, right? Which then takes us to the work of Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead's work starts on slide 14. And Mead, who is a person who studied under Boaz, so comes from the school of Boazian anthropology, goes to Samoa and begins doing ethnographic fieldwork in Samoa. And she is documenting the coming of age sequence for young girls, and finds that young girls in Samoa are encouraged to have sex, to be sexually active at a very young age. So between the ages of 10 to 12. And the idea is that if young girls are promiscuous at that age, before being able to conceive a child, right, that they can get sexual curiosity supposedly out of their system. They could basically experiment, for example, and it becomes more public and everyone sort of knows about it. And then when it comes time to reproduce, they could, a person like a young girl could settle down with the right person and not have such a high taboo around sexual activity. Part of that also, what was embedded in the philosophy, as Mead describes it, is that there was no taboo against explaining sex to young children. And so young girls were not only encouraged to sexually be free, but young children knew about sex at a very young age. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, this was quite different than what we saw in the Western culture, particularly the Western Judeo-Christian culture, which was very much about either masking or holding off on explaining sex, because the idea is that you essentially don't want to teach children about sex because you want to withhold that from their kind of experimental growth platform, right? That you don't want to give children a part of that as part of their toolkit, right? And Mead argued that as a result of that there was no evident sign of what is called teenage angst, right? That young girls in Samoa didn't have that anxious, aggressive resentment towards their parents, largely because at a very young age, their parents saw them as sexual beings and saw them as parts of the adult society, right? And ultimately, young girls, young children in general, didn't have to figure out the biggest secret about life, right? The most magical thing about life, reproduction, right? They didn't have to learn about that on their own or among their peers. They got that information from their parents. And so there was no period where the child knew about it and the parents didn't know that the child knew, right? So imagine being a young child, learning about sex on the playground, and then to have your parents continue to think that you didn't know about sex, and how that creates this level of maybe social degradation or even sexual degradation, right? And so Mead is pushing against psychology, right? In the same way that Malinowski and Boaz are doing, right? She's arguing that as far as young girls are concerned, teenage angst, which was thought to be a universal among young teenagers, doesn't exist as long as young children are taught about sex at a very young age. Which, again, challenging, but the result of ethnographic fieldwork, the result of living firsthand with a group of people and documenting their work. We then move on to the work of Ruth Benedict. This is slide 18. And Ruth Benedict, in her body of work, creates one of the first true recognizable theories around cultural anthropology and argues that people's personalities, although that may be determined by birth order and circumstance, is also the result of cultural conditions, that our personalities reflect our cultural values. So the idea is that in the past, we talked about biological determinism, where if a person comes from a place, they're likely to have the same temperament as the animals. And of course, we're dismissing that idea. Benedict argues that if a person comes from a particular culture, that their personality is going to likely be very similar to the culture they come from. And so her idea of culture and personality was very much around the concept that you could actually affect a person's individual temperament if they are exposed to a certain culture, right? And I think that for the most part, most of us recognize this. If we're hanging around lots of people who are very upbeat and positive, we likely will become kind of a positive person, right? If you come from a culture that thinks about things very positively, right? If you are hanging around lots of people, I mean, again, this is like basic, street level psychology, right? If you're hanging around with people who are very negative, you're going to find yourself kind of thinking negatively, right? And so the larger argument here is when we're around people who are functioning culturally at a level, what we do is we internalize that and make that part of our personality. So what I'd like to encourage you to do is stop the sequence of slides at slide 27 here. I know there's a lot more slides to look at. I'd like you to stop it there. That's what's appropriate for this segment of the class. And I hope that you have an opportunity to take a look at the readings for this section and continue to work on your annotations. Thank you. See you soon.